Hi, I'm Kelly Monaco. I'm currently unemployed, so I created this channel to earn some extra income. I'll be updating you with the latest news about the Drama General Hospital.
The truth did not arrive gently, and it did not arrive with hesitation. When Sidwell chose to reveal himself to Britt, he did so with the cold certainty of a man who no longer feared consequences, as if the line between secrecy and confession had lost all meaning to him. The moment unfolded not as a plea for understanding, but as a calculated act of control. He wanted Britt to know, he wanted her to carry the weight of it. And what he gave her was not just a secret, but a fracture that would spread through everything she believed she understood about the chaos surrounding her. Sidwell admitted, without remorse and without apology, that the crash which nearly killed Jordan had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated, planned, executed with the same chilling precision he had used in every other move that had slowly tightened his grip on Port Charles. There was no justification in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth. If anything, there was something darker in the way he spoke, a quiet satisfaction in finally exposing the depth of his reach. To him, Jordan had not been a person in that moment. She had been a message. A demonstration of what happened to those who failed to serve his purpose or dared to resist him. For Britt, the confession did not simply shock her, it destabilized her. Because once Sidwell spoke those words, everything shifted. The uncertainty that had once offered a fragile kind of protection was gone. Now there was clarity, and that clarity was far more terrifying. It meant that nothing around her was random. Every threat, every coincidence, every sudden act of violence could be traced back to a single source. And that source was standing in front of her, watching her reaction, measuring her fear, calculating how far he could push before she broke. Sidwell did not stop at confession. That would have been too simple. Instead, he expanded the threat, making it clear that Britt herself was no longer outside the reach of his intentions. His words carried an implication that lingered long after he left, a warning that her knowledge had now made her vulnerable. In Sidwell's world, knowing the truth was not protection, it was a liability, and Britt understood that instinctively. The more she knew, the more dangerous her existence became. Fear, however, was not the only thing that drove her next move. Beneath the shock, beneath the rising panic, there was also a refusal to become another silent casualty in Sidwell's escalating war. Britt had spent too much time navigating the gray spaces between survival and compromise to simply freeze. Instead, she made a choice that would pull her deeper into the conflict. She reached out to Cassius. Cassius was not someone people turned to lightly. His name carried its own weight, its own history of decisions made without hesitation and battles fought without restraint. For Britt, seeking him out was not just an act of desperation. It was an acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond anything she could handle alone. She did not go to him with a request for protection alone. She went to him with information, with truth, with a spark that she knew could ignite something much larger than herself. When Cassius learned what Sidwell had confessed, something shifted in him. It was not immediate anger, not an explosive reaction. It was something quieter, more dangerous, a focus, a narrowing of purpose. Sidwell had crossed into territory that demanded a response, and Cassius was not a man who ignored that kind of provocation. The idea that Sidwell was not only orchestrating violence, but openly admitting to it, expanding his reach without fear, suggested a level of confidence that Cassius found unacceptable. It meant Sidwell believed himself untouchable. That belief was the beginning of his mistake. Cassius did not see the situation as a simple act of revenge. He saw it as a shift in power, a destabilization that, if left unchecked, would continue to spread. Rick's fall, Jordan's near death, the threats against Britt, these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a structure that Sidwell was building piece by piece. And if that structure was allowed to stand, it would reshape Port Charles into something far darker than it already was. The moment Britt placed that truth in Cassius's hands, the balance began to tilt, because Cassius did not intend to respond with hesitation or caution. He was already preparing for confrontation, already moving pieces into place in ways that few could see. For him, this was not about reacting to Sidwell's actions. It was about ending them permanently. The idea of a direct clash between the two men began to take form not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. And with that inevitability came a sense of escalation that spread through the city like a rising storm. Britt found herself caught in the center of that shift. Her decision had set something in motion that could not be undone. She had chosen not to remain silent, not to accept the role Sidwell had tried to impose on her. But in doing so, she had also placed herself in the direct path of what was coming. The fear did not disappear. It changed. It became sharper, more focused, tied not just to what Sidwell might do, but to what Cassius was now preparing to do in response. Port Charles, already strained by loss and suspicion, began to feel the pressure of something larger building beneath the surface. The lines between enemies and allies blurred as the conflict expanded. Sidwell's obsession had pushed the city toward chaos, but Cassius' response threatened to push it even further. Because when two forces driven by control, power, and refusal to yield collided, the outcome was never contained. It was explosive. And as the tension tightened, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a series of isolated battles. It was a war in the making, one that would not end quietly, one that would demand sacrifices, and one that would leave Port Charles changed in ways no one could fully predict. Sidwell had always believed that control was something he could manufacture, something he could maintain through fear, precision, and the careful elimination of anyone who threatened to disrupt his plans. For a long time, that belief had protected him. It had allowed him to move through Port Charles like a shadow, shaping outcomes without ever fully exposing himself. But control built on intimidation was fragile, and the cracks in that foundation were beginning to show. The more Sidwell acted, the more he expanded his reach, the more mistakes he made, small at first, almost invisible, but now accumulating into something far more dangerous. What he failed to anticipate was that chaos did not always move outward. Sometimes it circled back. Jordan's condition had been one of his most calculated risks. The crash had been designed to send a message, to remove a problem, to reinforce his authority. He had assumed that even if she survived, she would remain silent, weakened, or broken enough to pose no real threat. That assumption was where his certainty began to collapse, because Jordan was not disappearing into the aftermath of his violence. She was waking up. The possibility of her regaining consciousness shifted everything. What had once been a controlled narrative, an accident, a tragic but explainable event now threatened to unravel completely. Jordan carried more than physical scars. She carried memory. And memory, in a situation like this, was the most dangerous weapon of all. If she spoke, if she remembered clearly enough, Sidwell's carefully constructed distance from his own crimes could disappear in an instant. For the first time, uncertainty began to press in on him. But the true danger was not simply that Jordan might expose him. It was what surviving had done to her. Near-death experiences did not leave people unchanged, especially not someone like Jordan, someone who had already spent years navigating power, betrayal, and survival. The woman who was opening her eyes again was not the same woman who had stepped into that car. Something had shifted. Something had hardened. As she drifted back into awareness, the fragments of what had happened did not come gently. They came in flashes: impact, heat, the suffocating sense of being trapped, and beneath it all, the memory of Sidwell's voice, his threats, his refusal to accept anything except obedience. That voice became the thread that tied everything together. The more she remembered, the clearer it became that what had happened to her was not random. It had been deliberate. And that realization did something irreversible. Fear was replaced by clarity. Confusion gave way to focus. Jordan did not need time to process what had been done to her. She needed time to decide how to respond. Because in her mind, this was no longer about survival alone. It was about balance, about restoring something that had been violently taken from her, about making sure that Sidwell did not walk away untouched. Her recovery became more than physical, it became strategic. While the world around her assumed she would need protection, that she would need to be shielded, Jordan was already thinking several steps ahead. She understood that confronting Sidwell directly would not be enough. He operated in layers, in deception, in manipulation. To take him down, she would have to move differently. She would have to let him believe he was still in control, still untouchable, still ahead of everyone else. That illusion would be his final mistake. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Sidwell's miscalculations continued to spread. Each action he had taken to secure his power had instead created new points of vulnerability. The more he pushed, the more resistance formed, not always openly, not always visibly, but steadily, inevitably. And now, with Jordan awakening, that resistance had a focal point. Sidwell was no longer the only one shaping the game. The tension in Port Charles began to shift, not with explosive confrontations, but with something quieter and more dangerous. People started to sense that the balance was changing, that the invisible force controlling events was no longer as stable as it had once seemed. There was a new current beneath everything, something driven not by fear, but by the growing possibility of retaliation. Jordan stood at the center of that shift. Her decision was not loud, not immediate, but it was absolute. She would not let what happened to her become just another story buried under Sidwell's influence. She would not allow his violence to define the outcome. Instead, she would redefine it herself. And in doing so, she would force Sidwell into a position he had never truly faced before, a position where he was no longer the hunter, but the one being watched. The danger of that transformation could not be overstated. Because Sidwell, for all his intelligence and ruthlessness, had built his power on the assumption that he could always stay one step ahead. He had never truly accounted for what would happen if someone he tried to destroy came back stronger, more focused, and driven by something far more dangerous than fear: revenge. As Jordan's strength returned, so did her resolve. And with every step she took toward reclaiming control, the distance between her and Sidwell grew smaller. The inevitable confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. And when that moment came, it would not be contained. It would not be quiet. It would change everything.
I'll be back at the General Hospital soon. We'll see each other again soon. Thank you for supporting my channel. Goodbye and see you again.